Hello, and welcome to this presentation about managing the challenges of conducting a face-to-face teaching intervention in the secondary school classroom during the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic. I want to start by explaining a little bit about the intervention and the study to place it in context for you before I begin discussing the challenges that the national school closures had on the study and how I've been able to mitigate for them. As you can see from the title of the study, it's predicated largely in the second school classroom, and in particular in English literature lessons. In a nutshell, the study is investigating what, if any, effect that teaching a combined knowledge-based and metacognitive approach to students learning Macbeth has on their academic attainment, memory for quotations, as well as their self-efficacy, metacognition, and academic anxiety compared to a group that's being taught just the knowledge-based approach. Approximately 160 Year 9 students have been recruited and randomly allocated to the study from the participating school, and over a year have been spent researching, writing, producing, resourcing all the interventions and gaining ethics and consent. So the original study design was a face-to-face classroom intervention. All lessons were planned so they could be delivered by their timetable classroom teacher in their normal timetabled English lessons. The scheme was designed to last a full academic term, approximately 12 weeks, consisting of approximately 30 one-hour lessons in total. At the start, every student began by working up to and completing a baseline academic assessment. For this study, it was based on their understanding of how the characters, the four witches, were presented in the play as a whole. It was designed to take approximately 10 lessons to teach them the knowledge for this, after which students completed an assessment and then followed one of the other two schemes depending on which intervention they've been randomly allocated to. 2 collection points were placed for psychometric data, one at the start and one at the end, and there were 3 different data points for attainment. The intervention began as planned on the 11th of January 2020. So if we look at the timings or the proposed timings of the study, the intervention planned as started on the 20th. By this time, staff had been trained, a trial acceptability study had been run, lessons were in place, all resources were ready, consent and ethics had been gained and approval had been gained. At this point, there was no indication at all that the intervention wouldn't be completed as planned. By the beginning of March, the intervention was well underway. Students had completed both academic and psychometric baseline assessments, and they were working towards their second academic assessment. By the beginning of March, there was some talk in the educational community and the national media about a possible 2-week extension to the Easter holidays for secondary school students to provide a circuit break to try and control the outbreak of a new COVID-19 virus. But although this would mean delaying the intervention, there was still no indication that the study would not run its course. That all changed on the 18th of March 2020, when the government announced the sudden closure of schools to the vast majority of secondary school students and primary school students with only 2 days' notice. At this point, students were within touching distance of completing the second academic assessment. Most teachers were 3 lessons or a week away from students being able to do this. The lack of notice and no confirmed reopening date meant that participants were unable to complete the intervention or any further in testing in a controlled environment, and so the study had to be terminated. Fortunately, when schools reopened to all year groups for face-to-face teaching in September the 7th, 2020, The head teacher and the head of the English department were happy for me to run the study to the new Year 9s. The original students in the study had moved up into Year 10 and were following a different curriculum path, so it wasn't possible to use them. Also, because they'd already started the intervention, it would have been difficult to track and to restart it. So the decision was made to have a fresh start with the students that were now in Year 9 and had originally been in Year 8 when the original study was run. Although this did necessitate new ethical approval and new consent from participants being obtained. Unfortunately though, although the schedule was commenced, or it was scheduled to commence with this subsequent Year 9 cohort in the 4th of January 2021, it wasn't as simple as just rerunning the intervention. A number of changes had to be made to accommodate the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic on the new logistics of the school day and the impact of lost face-to-face learning had on students during the first school closures. On top of this, the intervention was further complicated when, on the day that it was due to start, UK schools closed as part of a national lockdown strategy, once again with a move to online learning, and the intervention was postponed. English schools reopened for face-to-face learning on the 8th of March 2021. So before I have a look at the different changes that were made, I just want to begin by going through some of the challenges and the logistic considerations that had to be challenged when looking at commencing or rerunning the schedule in January 2021. So initially, as discussed, we had to get consent for a different cohort. One of the main considerations was that, like all schools, the participating school had made significant operational changes to the way it was run in order to accommodate social distancing and prioritise the safety and well-being of staff and students. To do this, students were placed into year group bubbles, each year group with different lunch and break times. Practically what this meant that where previously Year 9 had 4 one-hour timetabled English lessons a week, they now still had 4 lessons, but these were a combination of 90-minute lessons, 30-minute lessons, and some 60-minute lessons with a 15-minute break in the middle. To make things even more complicated, if the teacher delivering the 90-minute lesson didn't have a timetable lunch break during the day, they were given 30 minutes cover during their English lesson by another member of staff. This member of staff was a qualified teacher employed by the school, but they weren't an English subject specialist and hadn't been trained in the intervention. Consequently, there were an awful lot more split lessons with more teachers per group to accommodate for when the intervention was rerun. On top of this, there was the real possibility that individual students and year groups would need to self-isolate during the new opening of schools. In order to maintain the fidelity of the intervention, it was decided that if individuals or the year group had to self-isolate, they would do a series of lessons that weren't related to the intervention, and when they came back to school, they would complete the intervention. To place this into context, between September and December at the participating school, the participating year group isolated for 2 weeks in a year group bubble due to an identified case during that time period, during that term. On top of that, Year 10 had to isolate twice as a year group bubble for 2 weeks, and Year 11 had also had to isolate twice for 2 weeks. So this was a real problem that had to be overcome. On top of these logistical considerations, we also had to take into account learning considerations that had been and the problems that had been established during the initial lockdown. You will probably have heard there's been a lot of national concern and media coverage about lost learning during the initial lockdown, despite the fact that online lessons were provided to students by teachers and that key worker students were able to go in and have face-to-face teaching during the lockdown. This was due to a number of different issues. Lack of access to digital technology and Wi-Fi for students, particularly at the start, and although later the government did provide a laptop to school scheme, this was patchy and took a while to implement. Some students were at home on their own all day and had no parental support. There was a lack of notice to get online provision in place, and initial lack of staff training and proficiency in online platform technologies to be able to provide online lessons for students. This resulted in different engagement levels in lockdown for students. So students returning in the new academic year in September had a variety of different learning experiences during the lockdown. Some had been able to engage fully and participate in all the lockdown lessons. Other students, due to perhaps lack of technology or support or other issues, hadn't engaged as much and had done very little written work during the lockdown. This meant that in September, the year group doing the intervention in particular, and probably most students across the country, experienced different or acquired different skills during the lockdown. Some students that had done more of the work had developed more skills, some students that were less engaged, not so many. And the new intervention had to accommodate for this variety of different levels, and also to help make up for those lost skills that students had missed during lockdown. So students, for example, hadn't developed the analytical skills in year 8 that they would normally have done, such as higher level inference skills and analytical skills within the English classroom. So because of those learning and logistical considerations, we have the challenge of making a number of changes to the intervention to mitigate for the consequence and the continued effect of the COVID-19 pandemic when we looked at restarting it in January 2021. Firstly, the main change was we had to alter the type of academic assessment we were using for data collection for the scheme of learning. Originally, as I mentioned, this was whole play based. So students studied, for example, the character of Macbeth over a series of 10 lessons and how he was presented within the text. At the end of those 10 lessons, they would write an essay based on the impression that the audience gets of Macbeth during the play as a whole. However, many students had missed building on the detailed analytical skills that they needed to be able to do that. So we took a step back to base the assessments on extract-based textual sections. So instead of writing about the play as a whole, they would look, for example, what impression does Shakespeare create of Macbeth in a particular extract, a short extract from the play. Okay. This had an impact on the timing of assessments, and that was another consideration when we changed the assessment. So the extract-based assessment meant that data could be collected earlier when needed in case there was another lockdown. So students didn't have to wait for 10 or 12 lessons to be able to have the knowledge to be able to complete the assessment. They could complete it much earlier on an extract that they'd studied within the course of the assessment. Another consideration was that the content of the intervention had to be changed to tailor it towards the new assessments or the success criteria. Although many skills were similar, the extract-based assessments requires much deeper analytical skills, looking at multiple meanings and ambiguities, and really drilling down into the meaning of the extract. And the way that the intervention was structured had to be changed to accommodate students so that they had both the knowledge and the skills to be able to tackle that, rather than a holistic essay that looked at how a character was presented across the lockdown. An extract was chosen as assessment because both extract and whole play assessments form part of students' GCSE English literature examinations for Shakespeare, of which Macbeth is one of the set texts. The division of the Macbeth scheme for classroom teaching had to be made to accommodate split classes. So instead of one or two teachers delivering the scheme, different lessons were given to different students. So, for example, most students had a teacher that was taking them for maybe only an hour or half an hour a week. So it wasn't practical for them to deliver the intervention during that time. So a separate scheme of Macbeth lessons that focused on some of the less prevalent characters, such as the Porter, Hecate, and Duncan, were devised for students to study during those lessons. Finally, we had to write an additional context-based Macbeth set of lessons for students to complete once the second lockdown had started, in order to be able to postpone the starting of the actual intervention. So this had to be written at quite short notice of 10 lessons. And again, it was designed specifically for students to be able to complete this online. So there were lots more video clips and flipped learning in this, and activities that were geared towards online learning with a computer. So after all those different challenges and accommodations that had to be made for the intervention, there were actually some positives to these changes that were made. So, for example, it meant that we got to review and improve the initial intervention. How often do you actually get to review and tweak an intervention once it's started? Although the teacher feedback for the initial intervention was really positive, teachers found it comprehensive, high level and easy to use, reviewing and restarting the intervention provided a fantastic opportunity to use teacher feedback to amend the lessons for a second attempt. For example, students in the experimental group were given more time to scaffold and create dual-coded revision cards after some students had found it hard to complete without additional support in the original convention. It meant we could put in earlier data collection points, so we could mitigate for hopefully, if there was another lockdown and we wouldn't be in a position where we had a lot of baseline data that we couldn't use because we didn't have different assessment points. It meant that students had a wider contextual understanding of the play. Although this isn't vital for their mark scheme, it helps with an understanding of the play. So, for example, they explored James I in the Chain of Being, the Gunpowder Plot, and how writing in a time of plague or lockdown might have influenced Shakespeare's writing of the play and his own experiences of writing during lockdown during Shakespearean times. Perhaps one of the biggest benefits for me was my own proficiency that I developed with new technology, because this really helped me improve the consistency of the information that students in the experimental groups received. For example, in the original intervention, the teachers delivering the experimental intervention were trained in how to explain and deliver the metacognitive elements, such as how the brain works, spaced learning, and explicit modelling, which they then delivered to the class. Although they still received this training in the amended intervention, I created videos of these strategies for all the students in the experimental classes to watch instead, meaning they were all exposed to the same training and instruction. This is something I wouldn't have even considered, let alone be confident enough to execute, if it hadn't been for the need to suddenly become much more confident in remote and flipped learning and the digital technologies that facilitated them during the first lockdown. And finally, the change to the extract-based question, which meant a shorter essay, which actually meant less which marking, which is always a bonus. So the intervention for this study commenced, fingers crossed for the third time, on the 13th of April 2021. All baseline data has now been collected, and the second set of data is due by the end of this half term, the 27th of May 2021. The intervention is scheduled for completion by the end of the academic year in 2021. And if you want details of the actual intervention, it's registered on the Open Science Framework at the link before. It has been an incredibly challenging 18 months. There are times when it really didn't feel like we would ever get this intervention done and that we were ready to restart it. The schools closed again, and that was incredibly disheartening. But by taking it as a positive, an opportunity to learn from the skills that we'd learnt during lockdown, the ability to adapt and to change, I genuinely feel that I have a much stronger and more positive intervention than the original intervention that was started in January 2020. And with a bit of luck, by July 2021, I'll have all the data in and we'll be ready to analyse. Thank you.